Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
In our first program, we talked about the philosophical underpinnings of the type of approach we're making here. I tried to emphasize the point that I think it's a mistake to view science and faith as adversaries. They don't oppose each other. They support each other. They reinforce each other. And we looked at a discussion that is a logical discussion of how we can know there's a God. There are two choices to start out with. Was there a beginning, or is matter energy eternal? And we've looked at one evidence that, in fact, there was a beginning, the evidence that comes from the expanding universe, the fact that everything in the cosmos is moving away from a central point, and that because that is accelerating, it is not an oscillatory process. If you didn't happen to be with us in the first video, we would really encourage you to go back and look at that before you look at this continuation of that discussion. Let me show you another evidence that we know there was a beginning. This is a picture of the sun. The sun is a remarkable piece of equipment. As a matter of fact, it's interesting as you look at the sun that what you're looking at is something that's very, very different than any process that we see here upon the earth. Down inside the sun, you're not looking at the kind of thing you see in a fire. You know, you hear people talking about the sun burning. And you sort of get the idea that they think somehow that the sun is burning the way a log burns in a fire. And that's not the process at all. You see, what's going on in the sun is very different than that. This is a close-up of the sun. And what you're looking at is a process called granulation. The sun is bubbling, it's frothing from some heat source deep inside. If you saw water sitting on the stove and if it was bubbling, you would know the heat source was down underneath, wouldn't you? And that's very much the same sort of thing that's happening here. We know then the heat source is deep inside the sun. It's also important to understand that we can measure the chemical makeup of the sun. This picture is called a hydrogen alpha picture. What that means is that the light that's coming to the camera is coming from hydrogen atoms in the sun. And doesn't that look different than what you normally think of the sun looking at? You know, the sun normally doesn't look like this. It's showing character here. It's showing a variety of disturbances, which it turns out are pretty much magnetic disturbances. And we can get a ballpark estimate of how much material there is in terms of hydrogen on the sun by this process. We can also do this with helium. And the process that is taking place here is a process that is called thermonuclear fusion. Hydrogen is being squeezed together to produce heavier elements. The primary process that we're familiar with on the sun is helium. So in our animation here, you see two hydrogen atoms being pushed together, being slammed together to produce helium. The problem is that the helium has less available energy than the hydrogen does. So the result is that energy has to be released. So the flash that you see is the power that drives the sun. In recent years, scientists have been successful in measuring the amount of hydrogen on the sun, the amount of helium on the sun, and making predictions about what the sun has been doing and how long it's been doing it and what the processes are on the sun. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, we're talking numbers like 290 million tons of hydrogen every second being consumed on the sun and being turned into heavier elements, helium particularly. Now, this just isn't the sun. Every star in the sky generates energy by the same process. When we look out into space and we see exploding galaxies, hydrogen is still the basic source. Hydrogen is the universal fuel of the cosmos. Now, there's a very simple principle here that shows that there was a beginning. You have a car, and you put gasoline in the car. If you don't put gasoline in the car and you drive the car, what happens? Well, that doesn't take any imagination. You run out of gas. You have to put fuel in the vehicle to enable the vehicle to operate. We all understand that. Well, I had some daughters that didn't seem to understand that, but most of us understand that you got to put fuel, you got to put gas in the car to make it go. Now, this just isn't the car. It's also true of the cosmos. If every galaxy, every star, every process in nature is dependent upon hydrogen. If hydrogen is being consumed everywhere in the cosmos, and if that has been going on forever and ever and ever, how much hydrogen would be left? It's like asking, if you drive the car on a very long trip and you don't put any gas in the car, how much will be left? And the answer is obvious. The gas gauge would be on empty. We know from a scientific standpoint that there is no way to generate hydrogen, that the processes in the cosmos tend to moving things apart and so forth do not re-add hydrogen to the process. And especially since the universe is expanding and accelerating in its expansion, it is very clear that you can't add any fuel to the process. So how much hydrogen should there be left in the cosmos? And the answer, of course, is none. Like the car that has been driven many, many miles, the universe would be completely void of hydrogen. There would be no hydrogen left. It would have all been burned up. But the fact is, the sun, and get this, the sun has only burned 2% of its original fuel, according to our calculation. The sun still has 98% of the hydrogen it had the day it came into existence. And that's true of all stars in space. We look out into space with our powerful telescopes, and we see things like this picture, an area of space full of glowing clouds of hydrogen. We take telescopes called radio telescopes that measure wavelengths, that tell what element they came from. And there's a spectral line called the hydrogen 21 centimeter line, and that line shows up everywhere in the cosmos. The cosmos is full of hydrogen, and that could not be unless there was a beginning. So not only does the expanding universe show us that there was a beginning, but the fuel system of the cosmos shows us there was a beginning. And there's one more evidence I'd like to show you. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a very, very famous law. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. And what it says is, as you can see, that any closed system. Now, what is a closed system? A closed system is a system in which no energy is added to the system. The Earth is not a closed system. So you can't use the second law of thermodynamics on the Earth because the Earth is having energy added from the sun as well as other sources. But in any closed system, things tend to move towards a condition of disorder. Carl Sagan used to say, the cosmos is everything that is or was or ever will be. Now, whether you agree with the statement or not, and I don't, I think there are some problems with the statement, but if you accept that as a view of the cosmos in any way, shape, or form, it's a gorgeous definition of a closed system. So what's this got to do with anything? All right, let me give you a really simplified explanation of the second law. Many years ago, we had a daughter named Wendy. And when Wendy became a part of our family, she was moved into a room. And the room looked something like what you see on the screen. It was perfectly organized. Everything had a place. It was beautiful. What happened to that room? Well, it looked more like this by the time she left it. And as a matter of fact, if there hadn't been an external source of energy, her parents, the room would have been in total chaos. This is the second law. Now that's a very, very trivial example, but it gives you a perspective of this principle behind the law. And it's important to understand that this applies in the cosmos. It applies to our lives. I am getting more and more disordered with time. We call that aging. And eventually, I will become disordered enough that there will be death. This isn't just human bodies. The cosmos is aging. We talk about heat death related to stars. And the whole idea then is that the universe is continually running down. We live in a system that is becoming more and more disordered. Now think with me for a minute. If the cosmos has always been, if there was no beginning, what would be the condition of the cosmos? It would be totally disordered. Some of you who are interested in cosmology may realize that the black hole is the classic endpoint of order. Eventually, everything would become completely and totally disordered. That is not the condition of the cosmos. Therefore, we have not always been. Now, in the little chart that you see on the screen right now, you see the three basic evidences that we have attempted to present to you. There are many, many, many others. But I think it's important to move on in our discussion and realize, okay, let's suppose we are agreed that there was a beginning. I'm not suggesting that this presentation has been so overpowering that you automatically accept that, but I think if you'll look at other sources and people who perhaps did a better job than I did, at all the picture you'll see there is good support there was a beginning to the cosmos as a whole. This raises another question. And both the atheist statements and the statements of believers agree on this next process, have recognized it. Our top statement, which remember comes from a well-known atheist publication, says the universe is not only eternal, but self-existing and not created. You see, the concept there is that it is uncaused. Now, interestingly enough, in the biblical perspective, there is great care given to give a juxtaposition to that. We have up right now a chart of the Hebrew words in Genesis. And in that listing of words, there is a word for God and there is a word for created. And I said to you before that we don't quote the Bible to prove anything here, but it does an eloquent job of expressing the choices. The word for God is the word Elohim. Now that's important because there are many, many different Hebrew words that could have been used for God, but the word chosen, Elohim, in Genesis 1:1, is the word that conveys the wisdom and the power and the strength of God. Words like Yahweh in the original language indicate the promises of God, or Adonai, recognize the ruling aspect of God, but the word chosen is a word that reflects the power, the creative wisdom, the design of God. It is used with the Hebrew word bara, B-A-R-A. The word bara is never used in reference to something a human being can do in the Hebrew language. It is always used only in reference to something that God can do. So Elohim, the God of power, of strength, of wisdom, created a process that only God can do. That's cause. In the beginning, God created the heaven. The word shahim refers to heaved up things. You remember a discussion of the expanding universe, the fact that everything is moving away from everything else? Isn't it interesting that the one word in Hebrew that would accurately describe the process of the movement of the cosmological objects is used? It's also interesting that the word eretz, the word that's used for earth here, is not a word that refers to some glob of gook floating through space, but that it actually is a demonstration of a working, functional earth. And all of the scientific evidence that we have supports that. Now, it's important to understand that our basic thrust here has to do with the question of whether there was a beginning and whether the beginning was caused. But the rest of the statements in Genesis 1:1 are scientifically testable, totally, completely accurate statements describing the nature of the cosmos. And later we'll come back and take a look at those statements in more detail. Now we have a little flow sheet in front of you right now, which I hope will help clarify the argument for you. If you admit you exist, which we discussed in the first program, the question is, was there a beginning or was there no beginning? We've, I think, shown a considerable amount of evidence there was a beginning, and there's much else out there. All right, if we accept that, was the beginning caused or was it not caused? Now there's an interesting perspective here because when you start looking at the atheist proposition here, I think you run into a big problem. And that big problem is the question or the logic of looking at this question of something not being caused. And the important perspective here is to ask the question of where does it take you if you take the position that something can come from nothing? You see, I've heard atheists and skeptical writers say, well, how do you know that something can't just come from nothing by some process we know nothing about? That's the safest argument in the world. I mean, anytime you argue from ignorance, you're safe. And I don't say that in a denigrating way. If your argument is based upon something we don't know, then there is never an answer to the question. So it's a very safe argument. But I suggest to you that this particular question ends up discarding all of science if you take this position. Because if something can come from nothing, whether it's a weird new process or not, then there are major scientific problems. For example, if something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of matter energy is wrong, which means everything in chemistry is wrong. I had a student one time who said, "Oh, now I understand why I have trouble with chemistry." No, that's not the reason. You end up discarding all known chemistry if the conservation laws don't work. If something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of angular momentum is wrong, which means everything in physics is wrong. If something can come from nothing, then the law of conservation of electric charge is wrong, which means everything in electronics is wrong, which means your computer doesn't work. Now, your computer may not work, but that's not the reason. All scientific knowledge goes in a trash can if you take the position that something can come from nothing. And I would submit to you that that's a very unusual position for someone to take who is maintaining that, in fact, we can intelligently and logically discard the notion of God. We had a beginning, and the beginning was caused. And I think it's important to recognize that these statements are statements based upon logic and understanding and clarity. One last question, one that will take some time. Okay, if there was a beginning, and the beginning was caused, then what was the cause? Now, it's important to recognize that when we start talking about this question, we're dealing with something very, very different. Because if there was, in fact, an intelligence that created the creation, something that is personal in nature, a God, then there are certain attributes that we would expect to see in the creation. And some of those attributes are intelligence, purpose, design, things that would radiate the intelligence and the purpose behind it. On the other hand, if we're looking at something that is not personal, then the question becomes very different. Because if we do not have a personal intelligence behind the creation, then everything is undesigned. Everything is a product of chance. There is no order. There is no reason. There is no design. I'd like you to take a look at a statement that appeared in one of my textbooks one time when I was teaching. And as you read this statement, I'd like for you to think about the questions the statement produces. Is this a statement of science? Or is it a statement of religious faith? It's interesting that when you look at what Huxley and other people have written, you see statements that are very different in this whole perspective of why you would make a statement like this. Adolphus Huxley said one time that the idea of the world not having a purpose, that there be no reason for something, offered great freedom. That this belief system allowed a person to be able to have freedom politically, morally, and otherwise. And if you accept that notion, then perhaps you have a very good reason for believing that there is no purpose, there is no design in the creation. But it has become a religious, a philosophical perspective, not a statement that is a statement of scientific evidence. And so what we propose to do in the next 4 videos is to look at the evidence that there is in fact design. Design that demands a designer. That there is a plan that demands a planner. That we are not the product of chance. And let me suggest to you that there are 4 levels at which that proposition can be investigated. The first of these is what I would like to call intuitive design. And the first video that we want you to take a look at that deals with this question of design looks at intuitive examples. An intuitive example is something where there's no big heavy mathematical analysis. It's just a question of looking at the incredible complexity that surrounds us in the world and asking, can we really believe that this is the product of chance? The second one is what I like to call architectural design. This is a situation where you look at things that appear in nature that have no reason to be there. I mean, there's no evolutionary advantage. There's no strength advantage, and yet they offer incredible beauty. They offer remarkable function to us. The third area of design that we want to take a look at with you in the series of videos on design is irreducible complexity. There was a book written some years ago by a man by the name of Behe that was titled Darwin's Black Box. And in the book, the author described some of the problems involved in some of the biochemical processes that happen in nature, but I think Behe's ideas can be applied on an atomic level. And we want to demonstrate to you some of the concepts that are associated with that particular presentation. And then the last evidence of design that we want to take a look at is the question of what I like to call the soft anthropic principle. And you philosophy students will just recognize the description of that process. But the question really comes down to a mathematical approach to whether or not chance is a valid explanation of the things that we see around us in the cosmos. These are scientific perspectives. And let me say to you again, we're not arguing here from any kind of biblical standpoint. We use the biblical quotes only to emphasize that accurately there is a description given that we can scientifically test that demonstrates the validity of the statement, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And our fundamental message to those of you who are believers is you don't have to put your brain in a closet to be a Christian. You can logically and intelligently believe that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. We'd like to encourage you to pursue these studies in more detail. The next couple of videos will look at the design issue, but we also have this material available to you in written form. And so we would encourage you to contact us, to ask questions that you have through email or in other forms, and enable us to continue to look with you at the evidence that there is a God and that it is the God of the Bible that we're talking about.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.